Coming to you on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto. Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and I am joined today by my co-host, Daniel Wolfsong.
Hello, lovelies.
Today we are turning our thoughts, our criticism, and our calls to action inward on our own movements to explore some of the problematic things we've seen in our own worlds as queer and trans non-believers. First, I want to remind everyone of some upcoming awesomeness. September 11th through 13th is the Pennsylvania State Atheist Humanist Convention. I won't be speaking, but I'll be there, and I want hugs from everyone. Lots of awesome speakers: Seth Andrews, Matt Dillahunty, Aaron Ra, David Fitzgerald, Beth Presswood, and many, many more. For more info, check out atheistpa.org. And then October 2nd through 4th is the Carolina Secular Conference in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It will also be my first speaking engagement ever at an atheist conference. My talk is called Gaytheism 101, and I am speaking along so many people that I respect, like Sarah Moorhead, Teresa McBain, Mandisa Thomas, Shelley Siegel, our good friend Bobby C. from the No Religion Required podcast, and many, many more. For tickets and more info, check out carolinassecularassociation.org. And with that, let's jump into the meat of the show. So, for the first segment here, I want to talk about some of the more problematic things that I have seen in the atheist movement. I want to throw out a disclaimer and say, obviously, this isn't the atheist community sucks, but I think if we're going to be effective as a movement, we need to be able to look inward on ourselves and acknowledge some of the things that aren't so pretty that we see sometimes. And obviously, we know that atheism isn't a worldview, and we shouldn't expect people in the atheist movement to be monolithic and to all believe the same things about everything, and that's okay. But we do know that, we have conventions, we have nonprofits, we have lobbying groups, so we are definitely a movement, regardless of, the fact that we have lots of differing views about other things. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and one of the inspiring events for this episode, Matt Dillahunty posted a thing on Facebook where he made it was sort of a between husband and wife joke that he and Beth had made about, women have two X chromosomes because you only have to tell them twice or something like that. And it's like one of those innocent jokes that you tell among friends. And it was like kind of a funny thing. And he prefaced it by saying, listen, this is a joke. This isn't reflective of our attitudes, because he just wanted to make sure that people understood he wasn't actually being sexist.
Right.
And the comments on his post were outrageous.
What were they saying?
Well, it was stuff like, I can't believe you're pandering to the feminists. If you have to tell your friends that you're just joking, then you need to get new friends. And
well, you can't see me, but I'm rolling my eyes so hard right now.
and then the conversation turned to things like, let's make fun of trigger warnings, because how stupid are trigger warnings? And then Matt posted another thing like, if you think trigger warnings are stupid, I'm going to delete your stupid ass. If you're going to keep making fun of this, I'm going to delete you because you're stupid. And I mean, and it was just more of the same of people just, talking about how stupid trigger warnings are and how oversensitive people are and how, people were disappointed in Matt that he was pandering to the feminist worldview. And I was just, and I actually posted, I was like, if anyone doubts that the atheist movement has a misogyny problem, go check out the comments on Matt's post.
Yeah, and that's just it's just Lewis's law proving itself.
I'm not familiar with Lewis's law.
Lewis's law is it was an observation by Helen Lewis a journalist who said that the comments on any article about feminism justify feminism.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that was the Lewis. I've definitely heard that before. But
yes, and that's you can any article or conversation about feminism. If you read the comments, you're like, yeah, this is why feminism exists, because people just get downright vicious and
screenshot, copy paste. This is why I need feminism.
Yeah, they go beyond they just get vicious about it, and it's yeah, and it's kind of interesting that people their knee jerk reaction to that is, that you're pandering to feminists, and it's like, do you even know what feminism is?
Well, I'm sure they don't. And on the post that I made, someone made the observation that most MRAs seem to be young atheist men, which that wasn't a thing that I had seen before. And obviously, obviously these are generalizations. I haven't taken a poll, right. So I'm not like calling this out as definitive fact. I'm just saying, in the conversations that I've had and the things that I've seen, like this sort of tends to be the case, that. MRAs are like the young atheist men who are just all about the intellectual circle jerk. Like, how awesome are we? How stupid is religion? And that's the only thing that I'm interested in talking about.
Well, yeah, because I've observed that atheism seems to have sort of two very generalized camps. There's the camp that really just uses atheism as just an intellectual exercise. They're only concerned with the intellectual side of it, and don't really go beyond that.
Right, or are actively hostile to it being about anything else like social justice. Yeah,
because when it's only an intellectual thing, then when you take all the human factor out of it and the identity factor out of it and progressiveness and things like that, or progressivism, I should say, all you're left with is an idea. And of course, you can debate an idea into the ground. And what has been gained by that? Because the other camp of atheism that I've observed is folks who seem to be more concerned with the humanist aspect of their atheist aspect of their humanism, I should say. And these are the folks who they tend to be more progressive. They tend to care more about social issues, and they're just generally more socially aware. And these are also the folks that I've noticed in a conversation where atheism is involved. They usually tend to be a little bit more compassionate in that conversation. They're not going for the jugular like some folks who are strictly in it for the intellectual position of it do.
Yeah, actually, if I remember right, I think it was Greta Christina that had a really, really good article on those. When you said, atheism is kind of working itself into two camps, and there's, the side that is all about just shitting all over religious people, and then the other side is atheism as humanism and people who are actually interested in social justice.
Well, there you go.
If I remember, I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. I'm almost positive that it was Greta Christina who did it, because I think I remember her posting that and getting a lot of crap from the non-social justice side of the movement, which is not a shock.
No one wants to be told that they're wrong, right? And even among atheists, the thing with atheism is it's not a solution to anything in and of itself.
It's a response to a claim, which is totally legit. I mean, people say all the time, like, atheism doesn't say anything about you other than that you don't believe in God. And I am 100% with that. I just, like, is that really enough for some people?
Yeah. Well, some people, they don't go beyond it. And then there are other folks, and this is, I think there's a big overlap here too, where there are folks who I think, atheist folks who I think do care about social issues, and I think they really do want to be better in terms of understanding worldviews that they can't understand from their own perspective, but they can, because of privilege or just because they don't belong into a certain group, who still are finding it really difficult to accept certain privileges that they experience, and because I've seen the atheists who are extremely friendly to the LGBT community, but they're extremely misogynistic, or they care about race issues up to a point, and then there's a certain point where they sort of drop off and then just start putting their fingers in their ears, and they don't want to hear anything else about it because the word privilege comes up, and they don't want to hear anything about that.
Well, right. I forget exactly what it was, but I posted something on Facebook about, it was something very general about, misogyny being an issue. Mm-hmm. And someone literally posted, I don't think I've ever met an atheist who's a misogynist. And I was like, well, I know exactly where this conversation's going to end up going.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it went exactly where we thought it was going to. It was, the misogyny doesn't exist because I don't want to see it, and a woman was mean to me, blah, 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 therefore reverse sexism.
Right.
Just, silliness. Like, and, but I'm poor, but I'm disabled. Okay, so those are oppressions that you experience, because those are disadvantages. But, you don't experience systemic oppression because of your gender. Sorry, you just don't.
Yeah, and it's, it's a lot to unpack all at once, but it's not a complicated concept.
No, it's really not. And I think that's, going back to the subject of privilege, which we did a whole episode on a while ago. Yeah. But I don't think people understand that when you say, like, you have a privilege, that doesn't mean that you're sitting up in a mansion with no problems and, like, everything's all good. It just means that in one specific area in life, you generally speaking have it better than people who aren't that thing. That doesn't mean that you have an easy life. It doesn't.
Yeah. Our buddy Chris from Unbuckling the Bible Belt posted a question recently that was something like, can someone give me a concise definition of
white privilege? Yes.
White privilege.
Yep.
And the most concise answer I could think of is white privilege. White privilege is not having to think about race in your day-to-day life, and as a result of that, you experience no direct consequences. And I realized that's actually a pretty good definition of privilege in general. So privilege doesn't have to mean that you have this, people don't like the word privilege because it infers some sort of, riches and silver spoons and things like that. And I understand the pushback on that. But when you look at it in this sort of context, where privilege is really where you don't have to think about something that another group of folks does have to think about, and when not thinking about it does not affect your day-to-day life. Like, you don't have to think about it because it doesn't affect your day-to-day life. That's privilege, and that's all it is. It doesn't mean that you don't have struggles in your life. It doesn't mean that you were born with every opportunity and an advantage given to you. It just means that there are certain things that you don't ever have to think about.
Right. Well, and I've seen that.
That's only one aspect of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, like, I've seen it in online discussions surrounding race in the atheist community, because there's a Black non-believers atheist group. Mm-hmm. And I've seen commentary on that, like, why does there need to be a Black non-believers group? Like, we're all humans, blah, 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 right. Like, reverse racism, white people should be able to have their own thing if Black people can, like, all those sorts of, like, really problematic kind of statements. But if you listen to someone like Mandisa Thomas talk about Black non-believers, she speaks very eloquently about why it's necessary for there to be a Black non-believers group, and I would encourage everyone to seek out anything by Mandisa Thomas. She's going to be speaking at the Carolina Secular Convention. I'm super excited to meet her there. But she was on No Religion Required a few episodes ago, and I would encourage everyone to check out the episode that she's in, because there's a really, really great discussion about that and why it's necessary. And if you would just listen, I think it would become pretty clear about why that whole thing is necessary.
Mm-hmm. And listening is the one thing that we find the hardest to do when we think we've already got something figured out.
Another kind of thing that I've noticed, and this is more in, like, atheist Facebook groups. It's not something that I've necessarily, like, ran into with, like, actual people who are active in, the community. But I've actually left almost every atheist group I've ever been in because people are super, super protective of their right to tell jokes about trans people.
I've noticed this too.
And and I mean, and it has been so many times where somebody will make a really cheap trans joke like, oh, it's super funny that there's a woman with a penis, or that, like, a trans person tricked a man into having gay sex. Bah, ha, 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 that's so funny.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you don't understand, like, trans people die because of those views and perceptions. Like,
right.
Trans people have literally been murdered because, a guy went after them sexually before they had a chance to say, hey, by the way, trans people have literally died for that. So
right.
It's just not funny to me, and I get it. I mean, I used to laugh at those jokes before I knew better. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I'm not necessarily exempting myself and saying, like, look at, awesomely political correct me. Like, I used to be there, so I'm not saying that, like, these are all, terrible, uncaring people. I'm just saying once I ended up on the other side of that and seeing what those attitudes really do to people, those things just became not funny to me. And it's amazing to me how protective people are of their right to make jokes about me, because it always comes from people like, no fail, when I see someone who is, talking so vigorously about, freedom of speech and having a sense of humor, and, well, I'm really an ally. Like, I'm like, okay, cool. Let's check your Facebook page out and see how often you've spoken out in favor of me or people like me on our behalf. Mm-hmm. And no fail. There's almost never anything. So it's, no, you really just care about your right to tell jokes about me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like you. I was there. There was almost no subject that I wouldn't tell jokes about or laugh at jokes about. And I think, like, one of the best things that could be said about me is that I had a lot of work to do, and I had some really rough awakenings. And these things, they're not easy to wake up to. There's always going to be that sort of mental pushback that's like, wait a minute, no, how can I be wrong about this? Or this can't possibly be as serious as these people are talking about. And that comes 100% of the time from a place of privilege. Just to, go back there again, it's because I didn't see the bigger picture. I didn't see the people who were dying or who were being beat up. I wasn't taking the full scope of the hatred and the bigotry that marginalized groups have to endure just for being themselves into account. And once I started doing that, I began realizing slowly, and then more and more, it's like a snowball effect, right? That when someone's telling a joke that's punching down, they're basically saying they're giving the green light for this violence. And I don't care if you hear that and you think, no, I would never want to see a trans person get beat up. I would never want to see a trans person killed. My question is, then why do you contribute to a system that makes that happen?
And that makes it, at the very least, something that's ignored, if not something that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Because these things they seem very harmless in the beginning, and I think I mentioned this about a lot of the homophobic and transphobic and even just misogynistic stuff that's in the Bible. These ideas and concepts and beliefs and sort of visceral reactions, they propagate out through culture, and they turn into violence. They become violence. They become murder. They become hatred, and you can't look at one end of that reaction. That's almost like a chemical reaction. You can't look at one end of it and say, well, this part's harmless, when on the other side of it, you have things like murder and all this violence. They're very intimately linked together.
Right. It's the idea that you slightly sort of objectify and dehumanize someone, and not even in a purposefully, not even necessarily in a purposefully dismissive or bigoted way. Like, I have no doubt that the people who are defending, their right to tell these jokes and stuff, like, when they say that they care and that they're not really, hateful or bigoted, I believe that. I'm not like calling these people out and saying that, like, they're terrible people and that they're, these monstrous bigoted people, because generally speaking, they're not.
Right.
But it's giving sanction to the idea that, I'm an object for humor, as
Right.
opposed to like, you know what? Like, I'm a human being. I like sex. That's okay. Me having sex with another person is not funny. It's not a thing for a joke.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm a human being with sexual needs like anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, having sex with me is not a punchline. It's not a joke. It's not a reason to make fun of someone.
Right.
So it's just like, I don't know, when you're on the other side of those things, those jokes just become less funny. And I mean, it's the same thing with rape jokes. I used to laugh at rape jokes.
Yeah.
You know, I used to be a huge Family Guy fan, and I would laugh at all of the horrible jokes about rape and domestic violence and all that sort of stuff. And then I started actually working with people who have been affected by it. You know, thankfully I haven't been personally affected by it, but you know, I've gotten to know really well people who have, and I used to work for a nonprofit that dealt very closely with those kinds of things. And you know, when you meet people and you see the real world effects that those things have, those jokes just stop being funny.
Yeah, and you really got to look at this as a bunch of little tiny gears that are all working together in this huge machine, because culture is way more complicated than just a joke or, you know,
Right.
a movement, or, you know, even a single movement. But you know, basically, and just to clarify, I think the folks who do these, who tell these jokes on Facebook, I don't think they're terrible people most of the time, and I don't think they want to see anyone get hurt. But you got to understand, you know, especially if you're one of these people who do this, just like I did it. There was a time when I was doing it. There was a time when you were doing it. If you're one of these people doing this, you got to realize that you're just keeping some of those smaller gears turning that result in terrible things happening as the gears turn throughout the expanse of the machine, to give sort of an awkward metaphor for that. But so learn new jokes. You know, joke about other things. Punch up. You don't have to punch down to be funny. And you know, really, if you're telling jokes that hurt people, especially entire groups of people, and you're trying to defend your right to do that, that kind of speaks a lot about your character.
Yeah. Nick Morgan-Moore, who is a friend of ours and who was on the Imaginary Gaytheists show episode, he's a comedian. He's hilarious, and all of his jokes punch up or are very intellectual when it comes. He tells a trans joke that's hilarious because it very deliberately plays itself up as if it's going to be a bigoted joke, and the punchline is that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually really, really good. It's kind of vulgar, so I'm not going to repeat it here because we like to try to be PG-13, but get on YouTube and look up Nick Morgan-Moore. He is a fantastic human being, a really funny comedian, and I've had talks with him about this, and he's like, you know, put more effort into your comedy. You know what I mean? Like, those kind of jokes are easy.
Yeah.
You know, put more effort into your jokes, and if they're not funny, move on. Like, that's what you're supposed to do as a comedian. And that's, you know, one of many reasons I love that guy so much.
I agree. Nick is an awesome guy.
So wrapping up this segment, I will say, despite all of these things, because let's keep in mind here that no movement is ever going to be perfect, right? No movement has been or ever will be perfect. There will always be things to criticize and things to improve on in any movement of any kind. And the reason why I wanted to do this episode is because I don't ever want the atheist movement or the people in the atheist movement put up on pedestals as if, they/we are above criticism, or that, we don't have room to improve on things. So it's kind of, I wanted to do this out of love, because I still honestly believe that the secular and atheist movement is the best place for people to be who care about social justice. There are obviously many, many, many people who are religious who do genuinely care about social justice. But I think the easiest way to care about social justice is through a secular humanist worldview or an atheist worldview, because there's no dogma. You can look around the world, you can look around you at the world that you're in and take it for what it is without having to have, some dictate from on high. So,
yeah, when like dogma and mythos and instructions from a deity, those things they're static. They don't change. And we're in a world where we're constantly learning new things. We're constantly learning more about the universe around us. We're constantly learning how to treat each other. A static worldview does not fit into that. And I just want to say, kind of going along with what you were saying earlier about this being a message of love, even though it sounds like, a bit of admonishment, is we know that the atheist movement it's a pretty loosely knit movement. It's not like it's not like it's really unified, because being an atheist can be so many things to so many people, right? But if you are an atheist who takes part in a lot of online discussions, or you go to conferences or meetups, just look around and see who's missing from the group. Who, are you spending a lot of time in groups that don't have LGBT folks, or is it? Do you look around and you don't see a lot of black people? Do you look around and there's not a lot of women? Look around and see what's missing, because those are the voices that's missing from the conversation in your particular group. And I think that we can all benefit from, invite some people to the conversation, or expand out and find groups where these people are being represented and they do have a voice. And it's it just expands your worldview. And a lot of these things that some folks might be fighting for the right to joke about, really, that's something that ends very quickly when you experience, when you hear the stories of the people that these jokes are about, and when you spend a little bit of time kind of in their world. And I think that can only ever be a good thing.
Right. And I think, one thing I was kind of thinking when I was, putting together the run sheet for the episode, and I was, trying to think of just kind of going through the thought process. And I feel like so many people who get into atheist activism kind of do it by accident, because generally speaking, most people, when you hear about their, coming out of religion, you hear stories not necessarily about anything related to social justice. Sometimes it is, but I mean, a lot of it just starts out with, this whole religion thing just doesn't really make sense to me.
Sure.
And, they start coming out of religion, and that's when they realize how oppressive religion is. Yes. To everyone, but especially to minority groups, to, women, people of color, LGBT folks, etc. And so then they're like, wow, I have to do something about this. And because they didn't get into it with the idea of being an activist, they may not necessarily have the practical knowledge or experience in social justice issues, and that's totally okay. That's not a criticism. I think that's amazing that people see the problem and then decide that they're going to do something about it.
Sure.
I think that's amazing, but I think that may be where some of this comes from, and that's why I think, my experience thus far in the more, mainstream atheist community has been very good, because I find people who don't, they don't necessarily have the 101 or 201 on, queer and trans issues, but they absolutely want to learn. Yeah. And they absolutely want to know, and they want to be good allies. So, that's why, going back to what I said before, I still think the secular humanist and atheist movement is the best place to be for anyone who cares about social justice. And again, these criticisms are out of love, because I think this is the best place to be. I love this movement. I love so many of the people in it, and the movement has given me so much, and people in it have given me so much. I just think, no movement should ever be above someone saying, hey, like, here's a couple of things we might be able to do better.
Well said, Callie.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to dive into some of the problematic stuff in the LGBTQ community. More Gaytheist Manifesto coming up.
The staff of Secular Coalition for America lobbies U.S. Congress on issues of separation of church and state, and they've become a powerhouse for change in the United States government. You'll definitely want to subscribe to receive their email action alerts. These are updates for important issues and ones that you can get involved with directly. And hopefully, you'll consider making a contribution to the Secular Coalition for America to help them continue fighting for your equality. You can do it all at secular.org.
Today in school, I learned a lot. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me. In English, I learned that I'm disgusting. And in physics, I learned that I'm a loser.
Today in school, I learned that I'm ugly and useless. And in gym, I learned that I'm pathetic and a joke. In history, I learned that I'm trash.
Today in school, I learned that I have no friends.
In biology,
In English, I learned that I make people sick. And at lunch, I learned that I sit on my own because I smell. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me.
In biology, I learned that I'm fat and stupid. And in math, I learned that I'm trash.
The only thing I didn't learn in school today
The only thing I didn't learn today
the only thing I didn't learn
Is why no one ever helps.
Kids witness bullying every day. They want to help, but they don't know how. Teach them how to stop bullying and be more than a bystander at stopbullying.gov.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. This week we're recognizing Celeste. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheists Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons-only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheists Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. And welcome back to the Gaytheists Manifesto. Today we are turning our criticisms, thoughts, and calls to action inward to look at our own movements and our own communities and see how we can all be better. So in this segment we want to talk about some of the issues that happen within the queer and trans community. And they are legion.
Yes, they are.
I think that kind of goes along with because obviously the queer and trans community has so much diversity inside of it. I think that it kind of goes along with it that, because it covers, racial issues, it covers gender issues, it covers sexuality, it covers socioeconomic status. There's so much that encompasses it. I think it's just kind of a recipe for internal conflict.
Yeah, and when you just look at, we call it the gay community or the LGBT community, but really we're sort of basing a community on aspects of ourselves that really have nothing to do with personality or, outlook on the universe and on life and just things like that. So even just among like the gay community, there are so many problematic perceptions of the world around us, from misogyny to transphobia even. And I think people think maybe straight folks on the outside look at the LGBT community and see us as like sort of this close-knit united front, and that's really not the case. We organize and we unite on issues, especially legal issues and issues of violence and things like that. But the people that are making the biggest noise, they don't speak for everyone, and they're nowhere near the majority of the gay community and the LGBT community in general.
Right. Well, I've seen that, and I've seen the opposite, because I've seen where people have the idea that the queer and trans community is this like big happy family. And I've also talked to people who say like, well, it doesn't even really seem like it's really a community at all, because all you do is fight with each other. And it's like, and yeah, we absolutely do. But both of those perceptions are wrong. You know what I mean? I should say they're both wrong and they're both right, if that makes sense. Because obviously, there are gay people who don't think trans people should be part of the movement, and there are trans people who don't think that we should be part of the gay movement.
Yeah.
Which, it's silly on a level of practicality and a level of identity, in my humble opinion. Something you said earlier actually makes a lot of sense to me, because you said, the queer and trans community is not united by a worldview.
Right.
What we're united by is oppression, because when it comes right down to it, the reason that any sort of gender or sexual minority belong in a community together is because we've stepped outside of gender norms.
Yeah.
And that's, I can't think of anyone who has ever been included under that umbrella that doesn't fit for. Gay, trans, bi, pansexual, demisexual, asexual, those people are all stigmatized and excluded from society because, as a man, you're supposed to do this. As a woman, you're supposed to do this. And when you don't, you're punished for it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do see that as movements progress and gain traction, and as groups get a louder and louder voice, and the world around us begins to change. Look around. It's happening now.
Right.
I do think it's natural for movements to fracture, especially one that's as diverse as the LGBT movement, because even just LGBT as an acronym doesn't even fit us all in there.
Exactly. And that's why
we're running out of letters to use.
Well, right. I think the most inclusive acronym I've ever seen has like 12 letters in it.
Yeah, and if I want to go that route, I'll usually just say the queer community.
I say queer and trans community because to me that's like the least cumbersome, most inclusive way to say it.
Cool. There you go. So that said, I want the trans movement to have its own voice, and I think that it does. And I think that we're seeing the fruits of that. I think, but the point that you're getting at, I think, is that a lot of the division that is happening just within the queer and trans community is coming from like a sense of otherness, less of we should sort of combine our voices and more of, well, you don't belong because you're a trans person, you don't know what it is to be gay, you don't belong.
Right.
And that I disagree with, because our struggles are not the same. They do have parallels, and we typically experience very similar modes of oppression. But why is that even something that you're going to focus on? And
right. Well, and it even happens within the trans community. There are definitely people in the trans community who have this attitude that some people aren't trans enough, quote unquote.
Now what does that mean? Because I saw that, and that's intriguing to me.
So the idea being that there are trans people who don't believe you're actually trans unless you want surgery or unless you're pursuing surgery, and that you're not real unless you need those things. It's not seen as an identity as much as it's seen as like, if you're not going to have SRS, you're not really a trans woman, or, if you're not going to have top surgery, you're not really a trans man. And, there are some segments of the community that kind of place a hierarchy. Like there are people who just present differently, and they're like on the bottom of the rung. And then once you've started hormones, you take a step up in the hierarchy. And then once you've had surgeries, you're even a step up in the hierarchy. And there seems to be this focus on, if you're real, that's what you should be pursuing, and that the apex of transness is surgeries and physical transition. Right, as opposed to someone just honestly pursuing their identity and what they want. And, for me personally, the only hierarchy that exists, and I don't even necessarily mean hierarchy in terms of like authority or who's better, but the people that I put on a pedestal are the people who are honestly pursuing what they want and who have met whatever goals that they have for themselves. And so if that means surgery and they're eventually able to do that and accomplish that, then I'm happy for them that they got what they want. It's not because I think surgery is a necessary thing, a necessary component of being trans. It's because that's what that person wanted and they were able to do it. So I'm happy that they were able to get what they wanted. And that's what we should really be focusing on as a movement, especially, and there's an attitude in the trans community that's a complete erasure of non-binary identities, people who are genderqueer or gender fluid. I think there are lots of people in the trans movement who don't know how to handle that, because someone like me, I am binary identified. I identify strictly as female. I jumped out of one box straight into another, and I am happy with that, because that's what I want for myself, and that's what my identity is. But I would absolutely never, ever expect that of someone else, who that doesn't fit for. And I think there are, well, I don't think, I know there are people, because I've met them, who just don't think that being genderqueer is even a thing. And it's the same kind of attitude that some people have towards people who identify as bisexual, that they're just confused and they can't pick one.
Yeah, and doesn't all this, this genderqueer isn't real, bisexuality isn't real. It seems to me that this mostly comes from, people who identify as genderqueer or bisexual, just for example, don't seem to be making a lot of noise, or don't have a platform to even really have a loud voice. And even in these, subcultures, and two, people who are quick to say that they don't exist, say that because they don't know anyone who identifies that way. And it's really easy to disregard an entire concept if you have no direct experience with it. And, if you've never heard any stories that talk about this concept, or, personal stories, it's really easy to just say, oh, that doesn't exist.
Well, right. It goes back to the idea that, we grow up in the world thinking that things have to exist in binaries.
Yeah.
And that goes for everything in the world, like not even just gender and sexuality, but just that, there is X and there is Y, and you are one or the other. There is no in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is how we grow up. And I think that a lot of folks, I'm big into everyone telling their stories and listening to stories. And I think that's something that we're lacking a lot of. I don't really know where to go from there. I think it's something that we're lacking. I don't know what the answer is, except for like you were saying earlier, we've got to listen more. We've got to be able to listen, but we've also got to be willing to kind of expand out of our corners of culture and meet new people and experience new things.
Yeah, I think hierarchies of privilege exist everywhere, obviously, and that even goes for the queer and trans community. I read an article once, and I think it was just something like, I think the title was just something like "What My Fear Is," and again, if I remember, I'll find it and I'll put the link in the show notes for it. But the guy who wrote the article, if memory serves, was a white gay guy. And what he was talking about, and this was like 2 days after the marriage equality decision came down. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, like, what my fear is now, that white cis gay men are just one thin layer away from joining mainstream society in, the hierarchy of privilege. And that what you start to see in those movements are, the same things that you see in the mainstream community, where, people who are in those positions sort of forget about the people that are, that are behind them and that haven't quite, caught up. That was when President Obama was talking about the Supreme Court decision. I think the most important sentence in his entire speech was one that nobody talked about. And that was, he said that those who are helped by things like this have a responsibility to reach behind them to help others join them.
Yes.
And I think that was the most important line of the entire speech that he gave. And I don't think I heard any pundit mention it. But that's kind of, that's a fear that I kind of have. And, luckily it's not something that I've seen really play out very much, at least in my local community, because I'm very, very involved in my local queer and trans community. And, the folks here definitely seem to have their hearts in the right place, and they're not about to, leave the rest of us behind because they've got theirs. The narrative was very much like, this is awesome, still tons of work to do, like, you know, we need to get back to work on this. And that's generally how it's played out. So I'm happy with that. But I think, you know, as folks start to get more comfortable, I think that may be something that we have to fight more. You know, and I've seen, you know, we were talking about racism in the atheist movement, and I mean, I've seen the same kind of thing in, you know, in the queer and trans movement. I mean, I've been in meetings where, you know, we bring up the lack of the lack of racial diversity in an event, or in, you know who's going to be speaking at an event, and I'll point out something like, you know, trans people of color are dying, and we're having all white trans people, you know, talking about it. Like, you don't understand, like, that's kind of problematic. And like, there were people in the room that just kind of looked at me like, well, you can talk about that. And I'm like, well, that's not the point. I mean, a cis person can talk about trans issues, but we'd all rather have trans people talking about it, right? Like, we
need trans voices in the room.
And you know, and it just boggles my mind that people can't, like, they can put that together for themselves, but they can't put that together for other people. When it comes, like, you know, it may be a necessary thing for me to step back and let other people speak.
Right.
You know, and I've seen things like lack of consideration for people with disabilities, right? You know, there were a whole bunch of Pride events in my hometown here, and my understanding is that very little consideration was given to people with disabilities. Like, there were a bunch of events that weren't wheelchair friendly that, like, people wanted to go to and couldn't because of it. So
that's something that I've been seeing coming a lot more to the fore. The concept, I think it's ableism. Is that the
ableism?
Is that the
Yeah.
word?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just a little bit more consideration for folks who I guess aren't able-bodied, or you know, neurotypical, as they say, or mentally healthy. That's something that's really interesting that's been coming to the fore lately, that I'm really interested in learning more about this, because a lot of just, I mean, you know, for what you said, you know, lack of accessibility in major events, to just our language. We have so many built-in words built into our language that kind of demean people who aren't as able-bodied or able-minded, I guess is a word that I would use for that, as we are. And that's really interesting. If you're listening and this is as a new concept, check it out. It's been, my mind's been kind of changing a bit on a lot of things that I really didn't think about as much before.
Me too, actually. I mean, especially surrounding things like mental illness. You know, there's stigma everywhere surrounding mental illness. And, you know, the queer and trans community, I would say, you know, maybe is a little more friendly than the mainstream world when it comes to that kind of thing, because it's something that so many of us deal with. And I mean, you know, me personally, I mean, I don't have diagnosed anxiety or depression, but, like, you know, the WebMD criteria fit, you know, at least for depression. Like, you know, I mean, I've dealt with these kinds of things, and I've definitely dealt with the attitudes of, like, you know, well, don't let them get you down, as if, like, somebody being horrible to me and me being hurt by it is my fault because I chose to be hurt by it.
Right.
You know, you see the same things, like, you know, people who deal with crippling depression that, I mean, literally their depression doesn't allow them to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've seen people in our movement say things like, well, you just have to get up and press on. You're not pushing yourself hard enough, you know, stuff like that. Just a complete erasure of how difficult it is, you know, for people who deal with those kinds of things. And that stuff's not okay.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I really don't know if that's something that the queer and trans community is more sensitive to. I do know that in progressive groups, I think progressive groups are typically more sensitive to it in general. You know, whether queer, straight, what have you. Because I think a lot of people are realizing that mental illness is a very real thing that you can't just will yourself out of. But to quickly go back to what you're talking about earlier, you know, like hierarchies in the trans community. I mean, I've talked to you about hierarchies that exist just in the cisgender gay community.
Yeah,
It's
actually,
just-
I wanted you to talk about that too, because that was actually, as a matter of fact, I think you originated the idea for this episode because you wanted to talk about that. So yeah, I definitely wanted you to touch on that.
Yeah, I'm speaking as a cis gay man. I don't have a lot of experience, in circles that are primarily gay women. But I can say that there is a lot of misogyny that exists in cis gay culture, and it's that sort of brand of misogyny that's not outright "I hate women," just like how racism doesn't mean that you're running around in a white hood, burning crosses in people's yards. It can be often is a lot more subtle than that. But it manifests in ways that, what we call a Nelly gay man. Nelly just basically means that he is more on the feminine side with his mannerisms and, things that he does. Those guys are typically made to feel like they are inferior to the gay folks who are, quote, normal acting. And even the word that I really hate, straight acting. I really hate that term. And that's a term that a lot of gay people use to describe themselves.
Yeah, well, and you see that, and when you say like somebody's obviously gay, like what that really means is that they're effeminate.
That's exactly what it means. It just means that they're effeminate. And that's treated as being inferior. It's way easier to, and I'm not pointing anyone out. We have all done this at some point.
Yeah, myself included. So this is like, I want to emphasize again, this is not Daniel and I standing on a platform and pointing downwards at everyone. We are guilty of all of this at some point in our lives.
Yeah. And this is something that even like I still catch myself sometimes. I'm like, wait, why am I saying this? Or why am I thinking this? I'm still a work in progress in this camp. But it's a lot easier to make fun of and demean a gay guy who acts feminine than it is a gay guy who acts more masculine. It just is. And you see that also with, I know you see it with lesbians who are more on the butch side. They're sort of denigrated, but there is such an ingrained sense of misogyny in our culture in general. Gay people, of course, we grew up in we grew up in the same neighborhoods and schools as everyone else. These things are ingrained in us just as much as in straight people. I have tried to explore my male privilege and the misogyny that's existed in my brain for years now, and I'm still sort of unbrainwashing myself from concepts that I've picked up just, especially living in the South, growing up in the South. But gay men are very quick to treat Nelly guys and even just guys who are slightly more feminine as being less than. Even in sexuality, the concepts of tops and bottoms, the bottoms being the guys who assume the receptive role in sex with another man, are often, I apologize for the pun, the butt of a joke. And they really are. I'm so sorry.
I mean, sometimes you just gotta. Sometimes it just happens that way.
Yeah, moving on. Right. Yeah, they're made to be like a joke.
Bad Daniel, bad Callie, laughing at gay jokes.
Yeah, they are treated as inferior, and you have top guys who act really masculine. They're treated as somehow like the paragon of gay culture. We have very much ranked ourselves, and it's so interesting that it comes down to things like, cis-normative gender expression or heteronormative behaviors and personality. And, it's not even just gay people who, there are plenty of straight men, straight cis men who act, who are just feminine by nature, and there are plenty of women in the cis straight world who are masculine by nature, and there's nothing really wrong with that at all.
Right, and because generally speaking, and obviously sometimes those people are, on the receiving end of jokes themselves, but generally speaking, no one actually questions that person's, manhood or womanhood.
I think they're held under less of a microscope.
Right.
I will say that because I do, a lot of, I know some guys who they're feminine by nature, even though they're straight, because obviously the two have nothing to do with each other. That's a connection that we've made as a culture. That's really silly. But yeah, they get made fun of, and you can imagine what the jokes always are. You're gay.
Right.
You act like a woman, and because being a woman is something that
being a woman is the worst.
Yeah, exactly. So they deal with that. But I think when someone knows that a guy is gay, seeing the guy act in a feminine way, it adds another layer of scrutiny to it. So, but yeah, I mean that happens in the gay community. Thankfully, thankfully a lot of gay guys are coming around and realizing that, if in this case, what we call, masculine and feminine, they're really just gender roles. They are completely arbitrary. They're just accepted gender roles that they're sort of ingrained in our culture, and be that what it is. It has no bearing on sexuality, but more importantly, it has no bearing on someone's worth as a person.
I think that is the key right there. Obviously things are more complicated than, it's just who you are as a person that matters. Like, obviously these movements exist because the ideas are more complicated than that. But, I mean, like, can we all just start there? Like, can we all just start at the place where we're like, okay, you're a human being, and what matters to me is how you are as a human being, and, how you treat other people. And like we can work from there. You know what I mean?
I agree, and I have a challenge, and this is something that I challenge myself with all the time.
Daniel's about to throw down the gauntlet.
When you find yourself, if you're looking at this fabulous Nelly Queen prancing down the street on TV or in real life, and or if it's
you do understand the mental image you just put in everyone's heads, right?
Good. That's in my intention.
Okay, good.
If you see that and it makes you angry or makes you irritated, or if you find yourself using the term angry black man and you're a white person, or angry black woman because you're seeing a black person who's got some sort of platform speaking, and you think that they're just acting way too angry, and it irritates you. I want you to examine yourself, because these are always pointing to aspects of yourself that you really need to evolve on. It ultimately does come down to what we've been talking about, throughout this episode, privilege. But I don't want to just limit it to that. I think a lot of it is when you exist in a world where if you're a cis person, if you're a white person, if you're a straight person, you're already in a world where you get to take a lot of things for granted, and I want you to examine those feelings a little more, and ask yourself, why am I feeling this way about this person? Challenge yourself. Talk to people who are like this and hear their stories, and because I think these knee-jerk reactions that we have to groups who aren't like us, or to groups that we feel are inferior to us in whatever capacity, and your feelings about someone, they come out in your reactions to them, how they make you feel when you think about them or see them. Just be honest with those and examine them and unpack them a bit and see what they point to.
That's awesome. And I think that's actually a really good segue, because we're going to take a quick break here, and we're going to come back with Be a Better Ally on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Here's an excerpt from Nailed by David Fitzgerald.
Didn't there have to have been a Jesus? Perhaps he was just a wandering teacher or an exorcist, an apocalyptic prophet or a zealot who opposed the Romans. Perhaps he was all these things, or even a composite of several such early first-century figures. But at any rate, surely there had to be somebody at the original core of Christianity, arguably the most famous individual in human history. All this seems to be a perfectly reasonable, completely natural assumption to make, so why would anyone be so foolish as to propose that Jesus never existed? Doesn't it just make more sense to assume that there was a historical Jesus, even if we're unable to recover the real facts about his life and death? As it turns out, no. The opposite is true. The closer we look at the evidence for Jesus, the less solid evidence we find, And the more we find suspicious silences and curious resemblances to the pagan and Jewish religious ideas and philosophies that preceded Christianity. And once you begin to parse out the origins of this tradition or that teaching from their various sources, the sweater begins unraveling quickly until it becomes very difficult to buy that there ever was, or even could have been, any historical figure at the center.
Nailed by David Fitzgerald is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com. Here's an excerpt from The God Virus by Darrell W. Ray.
Every day, religion affects us in ways we may not realize. It makes your Uncle Ned spend hours praying for you. It gives your Baptist neighbor a reason to reject her own child who married a Catholic. It teaches your Pentecostal sister to spank her children to keep them from going to hell. It requires a Catholic priest to deny his sex drive. It causes people to give enormous amounts of money to religious organizations, and causes you to avoid talking to your cousin Jenny for fear she may try to convert you to Jehovah's Witnesses. Religion has both obvious and subtle influences on you and on society. This book explores the impact of religion on you and your world. It draws open the curtain of mystery and offers ways to understand and make informed decisions about religion. Have you ever wondered what makes religion so powerful? What makes people profess deep faith even as they act in ways that betray that faith? What makes people blind to the irrationalities of their own religion, yet see clearly the problems of other religions? How does it weave its way into our political system? If these and similar questions interest you, this book will help you understand its power in you, your family, and your culture.
The God Virus by Darrell W. Ray is available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
And welcome back to the show. This week we are turning our thoughts, criticisms, and calls to action inward to our own movements, and we're going to kind of focus on that a little bit in our Be a Better Ally segment here. So the idea, I think, to keep in mind is that we shouldn't discredit movements because they're not perfect. I obviously am a very active member of the atheist movement and a very active member of the LGBT movement. Despite all of the problematic things that Daniel and I have described, I love these movements. I think they're doing important work, and I think that they are making a positive difference. So no movement will ever be perfect. No movement has ever been perfect. And I think if we truly love these movements and we want them to be effective, we have to be able to criticize them.
Mm-hmm. And criticism doesn't have to be, criticism can be very loving. Sometimes it's just, let's have a conversation and let's let it be okay to let the conversation go into places that are extremely uncomfortable, because that's really where we need to be having them.
Right. So, think about it like this. I'm sure lots of people remember when Mike Huckabee said that he wished he was transgender so he could hang out in the girls' locker room at school.
Yeah.
And, obviously any person with half a brain is going to be appalled by that statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But am I going to go protest Mike Huckabee? Of course I'm not, because it's worthless to do that. He's not going to change his mind. He's pandering to his base. He has no interest in what I have to say. Now, imagine if someone like Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders said something like that. There would be a revolution, and there should be, because those are people who call themselves allies, and those are people who, say that they care about the issues that we do.
Yeah.
So it's okay to hold those people accountable when they don't do right, because those are people who, obviously when you're talking about politicians, there's always ulterior motives. But generally speaking, when you're talking about people who are allies, it's better to go after people like them because they're more willing to listen and they're more likely to change their behavior based on what you say.
And the people who are watching them are more likely to change their behavior as well.
Exactly.
And those are our people.
Exactly. So, I think another thing that goes along with this is not erasing the diversity of these movements. There are lots of well-meaning people who say things like, I don't see color, I don't see gender, I don't care about sexuality, so on and so forth. And I get where that's coming from. And, I'm not, just like, we've talked about before, I'm not saying that the people who say this are, horrible, like, racist, misogynist, homophobic people.
I think they mean well.
But what you have to understand is that those things kind of come from a place of privilege. I personally would love to not have to think about my gender so damn much.
Yeah.
But because it affects so much the way that I navigate the world and pursuing healthcare and my relationships with other people and my job and the world around me, I don't have a choice but to think about those things constantly. So if you're a person who cares and wants to make things better, you better start seeing gender. You better start seeing color. And we can highlight diversity and celebrate it. Highlighting diversity does not have to be a divisive thing. I personally, I'm not the person who, I want to have token black friends. I want to have token, poor friends. I don't want to be friends with marginalized groups of people because I want to be this, super shining example of progressivism, so I can, claim that I've got this badge that, I have a diverse group of people in my life. But I want a diverse group of people in my life because it makes, it enriches my life.
Yeah.
And, hopefully my presence can enrich their lives too. I'm not interested, honestly, in us sitting around and talking about how we're the same as each other. Maybe that's a little far to say, but if I go to an atheist conference, I really don't want to spend 3 days talking about not believing in God.
Yeah, just patting each other on the backs.
Right, we're at an atheist conference. Obviously, we all have that in common.
Yeah.
But there are people of color there. There are queer people there. There are trans people there. There are women there. There are people who grow up in extreme poverty. There are people who grow up in extremely oppressive religious environments. There are people who grew up atheist. And all of those all of those things color the way that you experience the world. And frankly, I would rather highlight those things than erase those things, because I think the more that we recognize the diversity that exists and the richness that comes with it, I think we're all better for that.
I agree. And honestly, if we're being honest about the people who say I don't see color or whatever, that's really not honest. I don't think that's an honest statement. I think what they mean when they say that is they don't treat people differently because of it. But science shows that we do. We do treat people differently if they're different from us. And, that's where the problem is. So when you say, I don't see color, I don't see gender, see color, see gender, and improve your, evolve, let your mindset toward them evolve. And, by pretending that they're not there, that they don't exist, you're also kind of saying, I don't see your struggles. I don't see where society is doing you wrong. And, we need allies. Every marginalized group needs allies who are on the other side saying, I see you, I see what society is doing, and I care, and I'm going to make a difference. And if nothing else, I'm not going to contribute to the harm.
Yeah. And maybe slightly off topic, but I see, jumping off of that, I see a lot of times people say things like, to gay people, straight people aren't your enemy, or to trans people, cis people aren't your enemy. And fair. But what you have to understand is that I don't see cis people as my enemy. I don't see men as my enemy. All that we're saying is that if you're cis or if you're male, generally speaking, you have a privilege that I don't. And that's not a knock on you as a person. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person or that you're out there oppressing people. It doesn't mean that at all. And frankly, we need you. We need allies. We need people with that privilege using it to advance our interests and to help elevate us and culture. So, allies are amazing. And I don't see people who aren't straight or aren't or I don't see people who are straight or who are cis or who are male as the enemy at all. Some of them very obviously are.
Yeah,
but frankly, I have trans people that I consider enemies too, because they are so, they're so racist, or they, erase, non-binary identities. So like, it's not, as black and white a situation as that.
Yeah. And criticizing cultural structural institutions that automatically put us at a disadvantage, criticizing them does not mean that everyone who benefits from those institutions is our enemy, obviously. So that's kind of goes in hand with the challenge that I presented earlier, where if you find yourself saying, if you find yourself feeling like you have to tell someone, look, group A is not your enemy, look a little closer at what they're saying. They're criticizing the structural institutions that are keeping them oppressed. They're not. It's not personal, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not personal. Just like when,
exactly. It's not personal. It's cultural and societal.
Exactly. And because you see this all the time with men who criticize women because they think that a woman hates a man because she talks about her some experiences that she's had. That doesn't mean she hates men. It means that our world is broken. Our society is broken when it comes to our treatment of women, and acknowledging that exists does not mean that you're at odds with everyone who's on the other side of that.
Right. And so closing this segment out, I think the most important thing to take away from this whole thing is that if you're a member of one of these movements in any way, and you see these problems or are directly affected by these problems, I don't think you should necessarily be totally disheartened by that, because so much of what I see in these problems is not malicious. It's mostly honest, innocent ignorance. And what I've found most of the time is that people are very willing to be educated and to learn and to be better, and really are trying to be better. And I think that we should be willing to ask for accountability in our own communities. And I also think that we also need to be willing to accept accountability for our own shortcomings when necessary. I consider, I try to consider myself, a white ally to people of color. And part of that, part of that identity is being able to listen to people of color if I'm trying to do something to help them and I get it wrong. Part of that is me being able to listen to one of them saying, hey, this is something that you did that isn't really wrong. So, that's kind of my wrap up of this.
Cool. I wanted to, hearing you say that, I do want to give a shout out to especially a lot of the atheists that I've met since we started doing this podcast. Everything that we've said here is for us all to get better. But I do want to say that the vast majority of the folks that I've met, especially the folks that I've spoken with and have had really cool conversations with and have considered my friends now, that you guys are amazing. And I can see that you're trying and that you really care. And it says a lot to me that, Callie and I, we have to care. We have to care about queer and trans issues because we're in the midst of it. You guys don't have to care, and you still do. And that means a hell of a lot. So I want to say thank you for that. And even, friends of mine who probably may not be listening to this show right now, who don't care much for the atheist community, but are also, strong parts of this conversation. And none of us can figure this out alone. None of us can. We're all trying to work this out together. And the only way that we're going to keep progressing is if we are willing to listen to the opinions that are hard to hear. Listen to the folks that represent areas of life that we don't have experience in. That's how we figure this out. I'm extremely optimistic about how things are going to keep progressing. So, thank you, allies, and also, I'm constantly learning too. I'm still, unpacking and figuring a lot of this out and trying to be better. I really appreciate you guys. So thank you.
Yeah. And I definitely want to echo that. There's a post on the Gaytheist Manifesto Facebook page where I've listed out all of the shows thus far that have had either Daniel or I on to talk about this kind of stuff. And, there's not a show among that list that I wouldn't highly recommend listening to. Most of the people who do those shows are friends, as well as, fellow activists and allies. They're all amazing people who really care. And I am super excited to be, counted among, that group of people, that I have so much respect for, and that have done so much in, paving the way, because, frankly, we've been doing this thing for like 6 months now, and there are people who have been doing this for years, who have totally welcomed us into the fold, and it's like we're family, and we were never not apart. So definitely lots of gratitude for that one.
Yeah, you guys rock.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to say thank you to my co-host Daniel.
My pleasure.
And you can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali.
And I'm on Twitter at Daniel Wolfsong.
And you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. Next week, because we've been doing a lot of really heavy topics, next week I think I want to do a good news episode. Are you down for that, Daniel?
I'm so down for that.
Okay. So, I'm really good about remembering to put out feelers for stuff on social media and Facebook when we're going to do an episode topic. I'm really bad about putting it in the episode itself. So, this is, going out to the listeners here. Next week, we're going to do a good news episode where basically either in the atheist community, the queer community, the trans community, we want to hear about good things happening. We want to hear good news. We want to hear awesome and inspiring stories, not to erase the bad stuff, because there's plenty of it out there, but because there are good things that happen in this community too, and there are good people, and I think those things are worth highlighting. So if you have something to submit, the previous contact info is the place to do it. Find us on Facebook, email us, thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. Whatever you want to do to get a hold of us. We want to hear your stories. We want to hear the stories that you have to submit. So before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, and knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.